in many ways, the science, I mean, the study of politics is very much tied to where it's being done.
Yeah.
I'm I'm an American. I grew up in my time. I'm a post-baby boomer. I'm not a baby boomer. I'm generation. I'm the first wave. I'm that transition between the end of baby boom and Generation X. We went to we had high school in the '70s, late '70s, and started university in the early '80s and things like this. By that time in America, political science had a very specific trajectory in that it was, there's a very good book by David Reese called The Tragedy of Political Science, published by Yale University sometimes in the 1990s, I think, or late 80s and 90s, but The Tragedy of Political Science, where he gives an account of what happened to American political science. American political science emerged basically out of reaction towards what they saw was the kind of the dominant political science in America up until the turn of the 20th century was basically that of the Federalist Papers and Tocqueville.
Yeah.
That this was the kind of and that was considered like the new political science. Okay, the political science of modern liberals, the modern liberal thought, the modern liberal states. And its focus was more kind of constitutional, legal history, constitutional history. So that if you studied this, you studied like the Federalist Papers, the American institutional structure. You'd maybe read some Tocqueville and Montesquieu and aspects like this, and focus on institutions and structures of things, and as well as the various aspects of law. What happened was in the 1920s, a very important moment happened. Not into it, but even earlier, like during the 1880s and 1890s, what we call in America the progressives, who were critical of what they saw the direction American politics was taking under the Gilded Age, and they wanted a more scientific understanding of politics. One that attempted to give a science towards it. Now, a lot of this was out of what they saw the success of economics.
Yeah.
In the 19th century, economics had a very big success. You had both liberal economics with the rise of the classical liberals like David Ricardo and someone like Herbert Spencer. Again, this is, I'm not going to go into that line, but they offered a kind of a political science that was using economic kind of reasoning to explain human behavior. In America, this was addressed also. Spencer was very influential, but not as. Actually, some people have exaggerated it. Richard Hofstadter, in his book Social Darwinism in America, is a very much kind of gives a kind of, it's a caricature, and it kind of in other words, the enemies of classical liberalism took Spencer's influence and labeled it as kind of the scientific, social Darwinism, and argued that had such power in our things, and therefore a lot of times the progressives were rebelling against it. And a very good example of the early progressive is someone like Thurston Veblen. And again, he is although he uses the kind of modeling of Spencer student, American disciple, William Graham Sumner, who's very, William Graham Sumner's folk.
Could you say that first name again? I didn't quite catch that.
Which one? Veblen, Thurston Veblen, or Veblen? Theory of the Leisure Class.
Right.
The classic. He was a student of the founder of American sociology, that William Graham Sumner. Sumner's classic is Folkways, but it's also famous for what social classes owe to each other. And Sumner's answers was nothing.
Yeah.
Okay. But Veblen, in many ways, was responding to the classical liberalism of Sumner, by arguing against, although he says that yes, men should be rational, but men are really not rational, utility seeking, they're status seeking, and therefore the left, in other words, the leftover of our earlier periods of human development still linger with us and therefore shape our current activity. So Veblen's analysis became a scientific basis to critique existing society, to explain why the people are behaving the way they do. Now, people like Veblen will influence political science greatly because it will influence what we call the behavioralists. This starts out with the study of law, with someone like Barber. What's his name? I want to say Barber, but it's not Barber. It's the economic theory, the famous book on the economic theory of the Constitution.
Okay.
It's called The Economic Interpretation of the Constitution. And I'm trying to remember the name. It's Barker. I say Barker. It's not Barker. I know it. Beard. Charles Beard. And Beard argued that he was basically another person with a beard is also a famous president, Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson's famous. Remember, he was a political scientist. He was part of this new political science that emerged out of behavioralism, which was basically a very much, if you understand it, the early political science was activistic. It was an activist political science. The early Americans, this new political science of the behavioralists. Now, what happened with that is that it reached its peak in the 1920s at University of Chicago with Charles Merriam and what's his name? One famous guy, Howell, with his famous book Laswell. Sorry, not Howell. Laswell, Harold Laswell. Politics: Who Gets What, Where, and When is classic.
Yeah.
That was people forget that was the Bible of behavioral political science. And what behavioral political science was this mixture of I talk about this in my last chapter in the centrality of the regime, where I talk about the way comparative politics evolved a certain way. What happened here was that this behavioralism of this 1920s by Laswell sought to bring in kind of the structural analysis of economics, right? The kind of analytical rigor of that, with the kind of the structuralism of Talcott Parsons in sociology. The structural functionalism of Parsons. Yeah. In the Chicago School of the Chicago School of Sociology, which was very structuralist, and looking at the connection between function and that structure determines functionality towards the goals what's doing. So the structural functionalism of the Talcott Parsons School, with also psychology of Freud. In other words, so this blending of, in fact, for Laswell was very much concerned. Therefore, that's why they use the word behavioral.
Yeah.
Because and behavioralism sought to be a science. Now, the behavioral movement hit its peak with World War II. I mean, first victory of it was the Great New Society. The Great New Deal, in 1930, because it meant jobs for the boys. All the PhDs from the political science programs got jobs in the New Deal government expansion of, and basically you got your degree for the purpose of being a civil servant or a specialist to offer policy analysis and analysis. And at first, therefore, this behavioral political science was very much a product of American politics. It was very American centric. Now, what changed this is World War II. And in order to fight World War II, the behavioralists became not only concerned about running American politics, American institutions, but also running, figuring out how to stop Hitler. So they did all this stuff about, and what happened here was even more insidious. The behaviorists got in bed with the Frankfurt School. The Frankfurt School, the neo-Marxist school in Germany. At the school, it's called the Institute of Social Research, at University of Frankfurt. Many of these Marxists, or not necessarily, they weren't card-carrying communists in that sense.
Yeah.
They rejected the Frankfurt guys. They accepted they were methodological Marxists, and they did not think revolution was going to happen. They thought it would be more what was going to bring about the revolution would be kind of a gradual process of changing the society. Okay.
Just for clarity, quickly, when you say methodological Marxist, is there something that stands out as sort of emblematic of that in your opinion, or is it more? It's like a general
methodological. A methodological Marxist often will stick with class analysis, and therefore, in other words, it's like a methodological Marxist is a Marxist who uses Marxism not for the concern of revolution, but to understand the society and the structures.
Mm.
And actually, Marxism. I mean, although I think even methodological Marxism is fundamentally flawed in many ways, and very limited. But in many ways, what it does is it mimics the older pre-modern science more than the modern science does, because it does pay attention to classes or groups in a way that modern political science with the modern thought, starting with the Hobbes, Locke, and even Montesquieu and Rousseau, and Tocqueville focuses, even though Rousseau and Montesquieu may talk about groups and things, the assumption of modern political science of the early moderns was individualistic.
Yeah,
it was the individualistic actor. The anthropology is that of individualism.
Yeah.
And therefore that classes were not less important than the individual.
Yeah.
Whereas the Marxist understood the Marxist, by understanding the role of that human people are sort not only by individuals, but they actually have to work in terms of they're part of groups. They're part of institutions.
So just for clarity, by individualism in this case, you mean like a kind of atomistic view of human beings as being sort of self-contained entities that can be sort of analyzed on their own, not necessarily so much. I mean, of course, this is also sort of implied in certain people like Locke and whatnot, but not so much kind of an ethical bent towards promoting the individual like you see in a lot of.
No, but that's the difference between the ideology versus the methodology. Yes, they reinforce each other, but there's a distinction between the methodological versus the philosophical or the ideological or the ethical. That's the difference between the normative versus the what is we say normative science, and we have the other word. I'm blanking. It's not the. Not positive science, but
positivistic.
No. That's a bad word in that sense. But I mean, it's it versus descriptive and looking at it and looking at the phenomena and looking at the way it is, how it is, versus normativistic is saying how it ought to be.
Yeah. Okay.
And the problem with therefore the kind of one that like Locke that says that we should be individuals. It should, in other words, the positive, the kind of the moralistic and ethical dimensions of it is separated from the methodological aspects of it, which aim at understanding of how the thing works.
Yeah.
Whereas, and this is a problem because, and that's the big distinction. The big distinction between ancients and moderns is clearly the ancients believe that we're social beings and have that while we are constituted of individual actors, and we do act individually, but we're also constituted out of certain groups. And that has as much that has impact in how we look at the world, see the world, and are the choices that we want and will prefer. So
well, it's always, yeah.
No, but back to that point. The ethical Marxism. I mean, ethical Marxism versus or the kind of ideological Marxism has the goal of revolution and change. The structural Marxism.
Duarte Carvalho here just made a useful distinction, maybe you'll think it's useful. He says in Portugal here, a methodological Marxist is also called a Marxian as opposed to a Marxist.
Yeah, this is just regional kind of.
Sorry, Carvalho.
No, but that might be the technique in the language, Portuguese and in Spanish, in these languages, how they distinguish it. Okay. Different linguistic traditions will distinguish it differently. This is why this is what language complicates things in this sense, because sometimes we are talking the same thing, but people are sometimes talking about the same thing, but are actually talking past each other because they're using different languages to explain it. But back to the Marxist about what happened. Marxism was a very influential thing. The Frankfurt School was kind of this kind of breakaway school of Marxists who was kind of rebelling against the Leninists, who really didn't buy the Leninist argument. They thought it was going to be more, the system was going to be different. The revolution was going to occur kind of organically rather than revolution, kind of like in the thing by the changing of society, and therefore their emphasis was more on society. And the way society works, and the way social formulations and opinions and identities are, and particularly with mass culture, mass entertainment, mass things like this. The Frankfurt School was very important because when they fled the Nazis, right, they went to America. They were, with a lot of escaping Jews, liberals, and everybody else. And the American University, Columbia University, New York City, brought them in. And what's so interesting what happened was that in 1940, when Roosevelt established the OSS, the OSS was basically a bunch of frat boys. Yale University, skull and crossbone people combined with Catholics from Georgetown and Fordham. And they said, "Well,
there's that movie, that awful, depressing movie, The Good Shepherd." Is that what that was? Yeah.
That's that. In many ways, that movie is very accurate in how it began. Though it changes the names of the people, but it explains the OSS embraced these neo-Marxists. Teddy Adorno was and Honecker, both of them, all of them worked for the OSS. Louis Assir, the famous French Algerian Marxist, was a member of OSS too. I mean, and the OSS was not only operational activities behind enemy lines, but it was also intellectual, psychological. In fact, Teddy Adorno's authoritarian personality was very much a product of trying to figure out the German mind to fight for the Allied war effort. So therefore, this was paid. Now, behavioralism, therefore, there was this weird mix that behavioralism said that, we're above ideology. It sought to distinguish between that we're just only concerned, we're not concerned with democracy, although we want democracy to happen. But there's a disconnect between our methodology and our ideas. In other words, our methodology and our science should be like I say, value neutral. The problem with it, that was not true, and that was the criticism of the behavioralists, was that they often were blind to the various biases within their own models, because much of their models had things like that. Now, but you have to understand, American political science of the 1950s and 60s, was 40s, 50s, and 60s, was totally shaped by behavioral political science. That defines their textbooks, that defines everything. And
Well,
World War
also,
II
yeah,
expanded it
yeah.
to the world, and that's when comparative politics emerged. I mean, there was never comparative politics. Oh, yes, there was, but the term comparative politics only emerged in light of what happened of this. Foreign policy was mostly diplomatic history in 19th century. There
You
wasn't
mentioned
kind of a.
Oh, sorry. Finish the sentence, please.
Well, no, I mean, the studies of international relations was mostly diplomatic history in the 18th, 16th, 17th, and 18th, 19th century. It was only becoming a part of political science when the behavioralists tried to take models. They took liberal models and started applying it to international relations. In fact, you can argue that this always happened. From Kant, the so-called liberal hypothesis of the liberal state or the economic theory of peace. And then what happened was then you had the critics of the realists who gave counters. So therefore you had both the realists and the liberals, and then later the neoliberals and the neorealists in IR. All of these are positivistic in their approaches. In other words, they're arguing about different rationality structures. They're arguing about how you weight the rationality model that explains behavior. They're just arguing about, well, what is the weighting systems?
Yeah.
And what is the motivations, and why is, and the difference between zero-sum games versus win-win games. So therefore, and the difference between traditional versus neo often was the bringing in of institutionalism and structural model, what we call pattern tracing, models of process tracing inside institutional structures. So therefore, that changed. I mean, that explains what that happened. But again, World War II and the dealing with communism very much defined behavioralism. Okay, it was very much connected with the SSR. The Social Science Research Council was very much tied to how to respond to the communists and how to fight, how to help to develop an American development policy to the developing world. Again, was shaped by the SSRC. People like Robert Dahl, Almond, Gabriel Almond, and you name them. All those classics of that period of the 40s, 50s, and 60s. These people shaped, the way American policy was made. In fact, Vietnam is the height of behavioralist control over the model. McNamara's whole approach to war and the way we handled Vietnam was totally defined by SSRC, Rand Institute, Rand Foundation, and all using kind of game theory models and the approach, the structural approaches of the behavioralists, both in terms of how to help fight the winning hearts and minds in Vietnam policy on the ground was very much determined by the kind of political development model that was developed by the SSRC. So that there was this complete collaboration between academic and war. So when as the anti-war movement came on, as Vietnam became less and less popular with the middle class. I mean, the anti-war movement was a class war against the working classes and the urban classes by the rich and the comfortable.
Yeah.
And what happened was that the comfortable classes, the comfortable middle class, did not want to go to Vietnam, and they legitimized their desire not to go this as declaring that the war is unjust, and then basically this became the motivation. They became critical of the anti-war movement, and given that the fact that most of the professors, we have to remember, Vietnam was a war created by liberals. Mm-hmm. Much of the anti-communist period of history, from Truman onwards, anti-communist was a liberal policy, not a conservative policy in that sense. So therefore, to understand so what happened was that behavioralism broke down. Now, being a child of the 80s, if you're a child of the 80s, what happened was when you went to universities, this is when there was the system broke down.
Yeah.
And that there was a kind of rejection against behavioralism. This is when area studies came into the being, and why area studies and things like this. There was post-structuralism started coming in. The attack on the positivism of the rational assumptions in the positivist social science became attacked by the constructivists.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore you had the constructivists in anthropology and in they started in anthropology, and then they went into areas like sociology, then in political science, and particularly through comparative politics, studying in the developed world and other places. Because once you're studying the developed world, you started to use anthropological methods. And that led to a critique and criticism of the behavioral method. Because the behavioralism sought a universalism. It was a theoretical model that sought a scientific universality. Whereas the constructivists often argued for localism and kind of like this, every culture is a kind of, and also kind of a historicist model, that every culture is a kind of little historic reality in itself, with its language and its meaning and its own, and every bubble is independent of other bubbles. So therefore, this is what defined that world. Then what happened in the 1980s, end of the 80s, rational choice and public choice became back with a vengeance. And therefore, by the 1990s, neoliberal economics combined with a neoliberal IR theory, bringing in game theory and method from economics and decision making, basically took, because the model was such, it was so, and this is also working in things like, you see this in evolutionary psychology, you see this in psychology, and not so much in sociology, but in psychology, the game theory and these hard modeling devices of statistical methods became very powerful. They won the day. Therefore, by the 1980s, with the new methodologies with game theory, plus also with the stronger quantitative data that emerged because of personality and intelligence research, you had a massive revolution in in psychology, but also this had a massive revolution in economics.
Yeah.
Public choice, all these aspects, and that this became, you had therefore had a very powerful tool in IR. You had it in IR theory. You had it in things. But the problem with this was that it was like a joke. If you have a nail, everything's a hammer, right?
Yeah. No, exactly.
And what happened with this was that it became kind of this is what happened with this. Now, what's bad about this is every stage here, right? The current stage that we're in now is ignorant of the stage that it was before it.
Yes.
Or before that. In other words, modern science, how it's taught, tends to forget its past. And this is what's wrong with political science particularly. And that's also what's wrong with economics. Economic science only cares, economics are a little better. Economists are a little better because they will talk about the older model, but they will stop. Economists get really bad when it gets to the anything before the modern era. They get to the origins of the economic model with Smith and the people just around Smith. But once they try to going into the medieval or the older person, unless they're Marxists, the Marxists tended to go back and artificially construct.
Yeah.
There's been some work in what's his name? There's a guy at University of California, Berkeley. Well, come on, I know his name. He's a very famous guy who does democracy. He writes on Athenian democracy.
Oh,
Ober.
okay.
Ober wrote about 5 or 6 years ago, wrote a book about the economics of the Greek cities, and arguing that everyone was wrong. No, Moses Finley and the Marxists were simply just wrong, and made a powerful argument about the economics of the classical world being totally more dynamic than it has been assumed. So there's lots of work happening in this. In other words, but usually the Marxists kind of controlled. Very few economists go back in the past. I met there was a guy I met, a Scottish guy, who was a Cambridge PhD. He was a little older than me. He was trained by one of the students of Keynes at Cambridge in the 70s, in early 80s, because it was very much a Keynesian in that sense, and didn't really like the Austrians at all. But his interest was medieval economy. It wasn't modern economy. He was a medievalist. In other words, he studied Latin. He studied like he would go into the kind of looking at the records of church areas and trying to figure out the economy of the medieval world. And he was very good. He was one of these guys who, because his marriage died out, he kind of fled to over here to escape child support. The child support agency. And he was working at schools here. But he used to write an article every one of there, and I was just always amazed that I was just it was very interesting work. He would publish like an article every couple of years, but it was what was so interesting about this was the application of economic thinking to understanding the medieval world in that sense.
Yeah.
And it was not Marxist. Okay, it was looking at the way behaviors, and you can see there's something like this going on in the scholarship of what's his name, the British anthropologist and anthropologist and sociologist, historian and anthropologist.
What's he write?
Alan. The book is famous. It's called The Origins of English Individualism. McFarlane. Andrew, I think it's McFarlane. His name.
That's right. Yeah.
And McFarlane was in that book. The Origins of English Individualism is an outstanding book because it just basically shows that the Marxists who advocated a kind of trying to explain the so-called peasant model, the difference between a modern economy and peasant, was simply wrong. That their description. Yeah. In other words, once you starting in the 1970s and 80s, as people started going into the archives of these medieval English, the English is a good example because they have good records. Because the Norman Conquest had good diocesan records, so you have records going all the way to you have records of diocesan accounts up all the way to the conquest. Okay. Okay. So starting with the conquest, every diocese has these good records of births, deaths, wills, contractions. In other words, and once you start looking at this and looking at the actual data, you say, "Oh my God, this is very similar." They kind of disproved much of the Marxist peasant scholarship, and this is why it's so interesting in that sense. So, why am I mentioning this? Because this is how economics has become a very economic modeling with good methodological, anthropological skills. You're going to do that's very English. Mm-hmm. And this has led to a revolutionary approach to thinking about the origins of modern society not being really as so-called modern, but maybe more medieval in their constructions, and that therefore we may be kind of misrepresenting what's going on. In other words, that much of our economic and our social life may have predated the modern revolution in that sense. So McFarlane is useful for that purpose, because he's and therefore that's why the British political science is much more interesting, because you had people like McFarlane, and you had people like what's his name, the man on the horse. The
man on the horse.
Finer, Samuel Finer. The final thing he wrote was Finer, Sam Finer. The last thing he wrote a trilogy. It's called The History of Government, which he gave an outline of all human history of government. That's the man on horseback. Yeah, that's his about the origins of the state. Now he was a kind of a he shaped political science in England, particularly comparative political science. He's a contemporary of Almond. In fact, he had criticized Almond very strongly, and Almond kind of had to respond to him. And therefore English Finer really shaped the way British political science emerged in a certain way. It was more state-centric. In fact, you can see Finer's influenced sociology thinkers, like someone like looking up here, it's up here. Theda Scott-Paul. She's her Taking Back the State, or Return of the State.
Yes. Okay. Yeah.
Theda Scott-Paul. She's a sociologist who talks about the centrality of the state and the understanding social policies. So she wrote about the role of the post-Civil War wealth policies of widows and orphans as the origins of American social policy. There's another one. I mean, the first name is Charles, but I'm going crazy. Okay, the book is Why. Look at Why. Why ? I know his name is going to drive me crazy. I'm blanking on it.
Charles. Okay, let's see. Put down Why Charles. Oh well. But, anyways.
No. Another book he wrote was called Regimes and Repertoires.
Regimes and Repertoires. Okay. Let me see if I can find it.
It's someplace hiding here. I know he's a very famous guy.
Charles Tilley.
Charles Tilley.
There we are.
He died like in mid 2008, 2007, like that. Tilley was a very important sociologist. This is a very good book because this is an accidental book. He wrote a book with his friends on contentious politics, a multi-series book. And in his contentious politics series, he said, well, there must be some structure involved, and his colleagues didn't want to deal with it. And this was started out as a chapter, and then it turned into this book. And this is a very good examination of a framework of analysis to understand contentious politics. Why social change, why contestation occurs, how it's structured, and how it leads to change and revolution. And again, this is a part of that bring back the state stuff was very much influenced by Finer and that his critique. And actually, Sam Huntington is another side, the other side of that coin. Sam Huntington and the other guy got here. What's his name? C.J. Friedrich. Friedrich was a German scholar who came to America in the 30s. He was at Harvard. Friedrich was some people like what's her name? Oh, the famous one, Judith Scalar, who's Judith Scalar, who died like in the 1990s, but she was a very famous woman political theorist at Harvard, was a colleague with Harvey Mansfield.
Mm-hmm.
Then it was Benjamin Barber. Remember Ben Barber from Jihad versus McWorld? Ben Barber was one of his. Yeah,
I remember.
Barber was a big champion of democracy, small democracy, small, Rousseauian city-state kind of democracy. And he was again a student of Friedrich, but also another student of Friedrich was Sam Huntington. And there's something, if you look at Friedrich is kind of has taints of Schmittianism.
Yeah.
He came from Germany with this German state tradition. Now that's the other. So I've given us the origin American. I kind of went to Britain a little bit. And let's go to European. European political science is very much, again, World War II and the Americans brought Americanism, and therefore everyone started, let's imitate the Americans. So starting in 1946 and 7, and all through the 70s and 80s, Germany particularly had a hatred of its own self and started to imitate everything American and loved behavioralism. It loved American behavioralism. In fact, behavioralism was much stronger in Germany in the 80s and 90s than it was in America. At a time when they kind of abandoned their own Germanic tradition of Stadtler, Stattlehr, Stadtler, theory of the state.
Yeah.
Which was the Germanic approach of political science. Political science was this more legalistic state theory in that sense. And Schmidt's classic work on this is not, see people look at Schmidt and they say, oh, his classic work is the theory of the concept of the political. No. His groundbreaking, he has two groundbreaking works. One is in his constitutional theory.
Yeah.
Which is his understanding of the state structures and the state and how it works. And his irrational relation one, his book on the nomos of the earth.
Yeah.
Which emerged out of his kind of abandonment of state theory and going into foreign policy, thinking about foreign issues of foreign affairs as he lost his job at the judiciary, and was kind of thinking about geopolitical issues and the implications of them. Now, the Germanics, therefore, Germany is kind of weird in this. You have either this older Weberian, Weber plays a very important role. You have in other words, you have this whole legal tradition that Weber's kind of critiquing. And then you have the Stadtler tradition, which goes all the way back to Kant and Hegel and Jelinek and this whole tradition of Stadtler, the German state theory, which was the basis of administrative law and administrative constitutional structures. You start with Weber's critique. Weber offers, there's three critiques. In Austria, there's a positivist critique by Kelsen, Hans Kelsen, who offers a kind of an attempt to give a rationalist, positivistic purification of just a pure theory of law.
Yeah.
Okay. Then there's Weber. Weber's critique, he wants to look at the underlying assumptions of law itself. And that's in fact he was struggling. Remember, he was originally he was part of this new. You have to remember, sociology is a new thing in the 20th century. The start of the 18th, the end of the 19th century.
Well,
sociology started.
Yeah. Weber wasn't a self-described sociologist, despite his reputation. He was a political economist.
Yes, in fact, he was technically a political. He was technically a judicial. He has his judicial studies, and then he started doing political economy, and then he started to understand society. In other words, he
Yeah.
was turning to the social. But then again, he had like problems in the sense that he had a mental breakdown. He couldn't handle the
He died at
stresses of
50,
lecture.
didn't he? He died young.
Oh, he died? No, he died because of the Spanish flu.
Right.
The plague hit him. He was one of the victims. I mean, the German economy was wrecked after the First War, and people didn't have enough food, and people weren't eating well, and he was sickly anyways. He had problems in his life, nervous disorders and things like this. Yeah. And he got stuck and Munich was a very contentious place. The Bolsheviks took over Munich, remember, and the Free Corps liberated it. In fact, his famous 2 lectures, the vocation of a scientist, the vocation of a politician, the vocation series, the students created these lecture series and asked him to give the lecture there on these 2 topics. Yeah. And they're basically a semester apart, okay? And at a point. And then he died within a year after, very shortly after that. And he didn't finish his book. But Weber's import was that it was Weber really had a very big impact on American behavioralism post-war because of Talcott Parsons and the way Parsons.
Thank you. I was trying to ask that earlier. Please continue. That's what I wanted.
Parsons and C. Wright Mills and their kind of appropriation of Weber. And by the way, there's a famous story I think it was Dahl, who was in the Army intelligence, after the war went to see Marion Weber and gave her lots of cigarettes.
That's Robert Dahl, right?
Yeah, Bob Dahl. Yeah. He went as a young. He already had his PhD. Maybe he didn't have a PhD, but I think he did have his PhD. He went instead of staying out of the war. He could have stayed out of the war because of his classification of his research for government rework. But he went in the Army, decided to go into combat, and he was in Army intelligence. He was basically field op intelligence. But Dahl's famous, at the end of the war, they go in Germany to capture, and he goes on a quest to see Marianne Weber. And that's talked about in an interview with him. He felt he got her a bunch of. She came there with a whole bunch of stuff to give her to kind of like, and she gave him a copy of edition of Weber's German, his Society and Economy book, which she and her students put together that book, and it's very fragmented. So what happened was Schills and crowd tried, Edward Schills and Parsons totally sought to translate it, and they reshaped it. They called it something else really weird. The title that they gave it was completely alien to economy. In fact, what happened was, even though they still used their translations, Berkeley published a new edition in 1968. Which it called Economy Society, the 2-volume Economy and Society, right? So that the American sociologists, particularly like Parsons, C. Wright Mills, became the voices to kind of champion Weber. But the Weber they championed was a Weber who they purged all the Nietzsche from him.
Right.
So he was more, in other words, they made him to be more rationalistic and more scientific and less concerned with the irrational.
Well, he's also he's a very florid writer. Like if you read him,
yes, in German, if you read him in German, he's a very florid writer. In what Parsons does to him and makes him unintelligible. I used to not like Weber. Everyone told me I should like Weber when I was an undergraduate. one of the teachers I had was he was a structuralist who wrote on he was a student of structuralism teaching at SUNY Buffalo at the time, as well as the school I was at. And he told me I should look at Weber. I should like Weber. And I didn't like Weber. In fact, and the reason why you don't like Weber is because of people like Parsons and the people like C. Wright Mills, what they did to Weber. Because Weber becomes unreadable. Same thing with Heidegger. The early translations of Heidegger they tried to force Anglo-American styles of philosophy on Heidegger. It just really, you got something completely alien to Heidegger. It was like, and distorted it in many ways. I mean,
well, now that you mention it, I tried to read, because I was taking a course with a professor of my own, Rob Walker, a couple semesters ago, on IR as political theory, and it was functioning as a critique of the state of IR. More or less. And I was trying to read Kelsen against Carl Schmitt. And now that you mention it, the way in which Weber reads in English, in most translations I've read, the Hackett one is a little bit different for the vocation lectures. But
that is the Hackett one is very good because this is done by a student of Strong, who was a kind of Frankfurt School guy, not influenced by the Frankfurt School, but Terry Strong. Terry Strong is. Yeah, he's a socialist. He's a leftist, but he likes Nietzsche, so therefore he's going to catch the Nietzschean elements of it, and therefore that is a good. There's a new translation out of Weber's vocation lecture, published by the New York Review of Books, and it's fantastic. It's very colloquial. It has a very clear style. And it's called charismatic and something else. I forget. It doesn't say vocational lectures. It says Weber, charismatic and something else. Rationalism and charisma, something. It's New York Review of Books published it.
Okay.
It's a very good translation. It's crisp. It's written by a guy who done, and therefore you feel the Nietzsche in it. You hear the Nietzschean tones. You hear the kind of things. It's colloquial. It's the way it was given, the speech. So therefore, it talks like. In fact, he says politician, not vocation of politics, but the call of the politician, the call of the scientist. Okay, and therefore it has a more fluid tend to it. But back to what Weber is important. Weber shapes the way. Weber indirectly shapes American political thought. But at the same time, the Germans started rediscovering Weber as against the Weber that the Americans posed on him. So there was this big renaissance on Weber studies in the 1980s and 1990s. One of the big guys in that was the guy I really like, Stennis, Stennis, Stennis. I want to say Heinrich, or I don't. God, I can't. It's over there. I don't want to go get it. So it's over there. Probably over there. He's not really well translated in English. There was the. Hold on, I'll get it. 1 second.
Sure. One of us is getting a workout today. Oh, and audience, ask questions because we're going to have a Q&A after. We're going to take a short 15-minute intermission, I think, after we move past this topic, which I don't want to now because, oh, dear God. I hope he's okay. But yeah, ask questions, and then we'll come back after a bit.
Well, that was pointless because it wasn't where I thought it was. I must have taken it someplace and not put it back.
I just wanted to finish my thought. Yeah, I just want to finish my earlier. Like, I really appreciate you bringing that up because that's one of the things that I found personally to be a massive hindrance in my political science education early on, is that bad translations of these people made them read like dry, he read like Kelsen, like a dry textbook with no depth.
And Schmitt is a wonder too.
Yeah.
That's why, thank God, Schwab's initial translations, and Schwab's little book was only one. In fact, this is why Gottfried was one of the first. Schwab and Gottfried were the first people who kind of talked about Strauss. Our mutual, our kind of, Mr. AA, is now totally gobsmacked with Paul Gottfried. Now, I know Paul. See, all the people, these guys who like, I was a student of Mel Bradford, okay, M.E. Bradford, and the Southerners, and Mel was a very close to Sam Francis was kind of a disciple, not disciple, but a close friend and political activist. To get, I think Sam may have worked with Mel when they worked on the Wallace campaign in '72. Now, by saying that, I'm, you're, oh my God, Governor Wallace of Alabama, everyone has, again, these kids, they're Southern, they're East Texan Southerners of the 1940s and 50s generation. I mean, we have to always, I take this that, always have to judge people in the culture that they're in at a certain level. And would I say that Sam Francis was a raving anti-black person? No. I mean, he wasn't going to be wearing a Ku Kluxer. He was no Ku Kluxer. Okay.
Yeah.
But was he a nice liberal of today? Hell no.
But the nice liberals weren't nice liberals of today. Like, yeah.
Oh no, the liberals back then would be considered. I mean, that's what neoconservatives really are. They were the 1950 liberals, the 40 liberals. Okay. So therefore, we have, and in fact, the liberals of then are kind of like would be kind of. I know that. I mean, come on, they're conservative today because today's young left would look at them as conservative. So, but back to Paul Gottfried. I know Paul. Paul's a good guy, but Paul is still bitter from him not getting the job. He was up for a job at Catholic U. He was teaching at this unknown little state college in New Jersey for almost all his life and retired there. Even though he's written like 20 books, he's still at his school. He actually did deserve getting a better place. But the problem was his politics and he wanted to stay in the New York area. Okay, if he was willing to go, because he was very much a New York cosmopolitan person. He knew Nixon. He hanged out with Nixon in New York. In fact, Nixon writes a blurb about one of his first books. Okay.
What?
Oh yeah, Nixon wrote blurbs for Gottfried's books.
That's interesting.
So Paul is a very interesting fellow in that sense, but Paul is also sometimes a bad. You always have to understand that a lot of times these fights of the so-called paleocons versus neocons, it was personality. It was personal vindictiveness on both sides. And I witnessed it. I wasn't an actor. I was an observer who were close to the actors on both sides. So I saw the bad behavior on both sides, and so I respect Paul for a lot of things. Paul, I mean, if it wasn't for Gottfried, we wouldn't. Gottfried created. Richard Spencer very much would not have come to as much prominence if it wasn't for Gottfried.
Oh, high praise.
No, because of you have to realize that it was Spencer's political awareness came out of his connection with the Mencken Institute that people like Gottfried created against the traditional conservatives. That they were trying to recover the older right, the pre-war old right of people like famous what's his name Mencken, very famous
H.L. Mencken.
H.L. Mencken, American Mercury magazine, the American language. He was very much a founding guy. I mean, he made so many of the. I mean, he made Ayn Rand. I mean, much of Ayn Rand comes from people like Mencken, the individualism, this myth of individualism.
That's interesting.
You know, the whole story of the libertarian right and Mencken shapes this, and Gottfried wanted to recoup Mencken as an inspiration, and I know people who were part of it. I never liked it because I thought by this time, once Strauss cured me, reading Strauss and Vogelin cured me of my romantic liking of the I could never really look at the 19, 20, 30 American writers in the same kind of like that I did when I was younger. Because once you got the ancients opened up to you, once the ancients became alive, it became impossible.